I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare, anyone? Hi, listeners. Elise here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Courtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Courtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Elise. How's it going?
It's going pretty well. How are you?
I'm also doing pretty well.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about our topic today. This was one that we were kind of like, maybe there's something out here for us to research and understand more of. We're talking about the Book of the Courtier, which is a book by Baldassare Castiglione from the 1500s, so it predates Shakespeare. And we're talking about how Shakespeare kind of examines it and how Much Ado is both informed by the Book of the Courtier and is responding to the Book of the Courtier and its popularity in English society today, and how we can see that in Much Ado About Nothing. Mm-hmm. We're excited to approach it from this direction of what is the Book of the Courtier? Because we've talked for a few other plays about behaviors where people are doing things that are not courtly, that are not this ideal. And this time we're actually going to be able to talk a little bit more about where was this idea of the ideal courtier coming from.
Right. Exactly. And I think it's important to note that the core of the Book of the Courtier is this is a treatise, a courtesy book. And as we've talked about throughout many episodes, books publishing, literature is becoming more popular in early modern culture. And so translations are coming in, mm-hmm. and English society is changing and it's adapting and it's taking a lot of cultural imports specifically from Italy. And we've seen that with Ovid. We've seen that with Vendettas.
Petrarch.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So there are many places where Shakespeare is getting inspired. And so these codes of manners are forms of social practice that were evolving, and it turned into a way of holding groups accountable for certain behaviors. And Much Ado is delightful in the fact that it, like you were saying, there's this examination and it challenges and it also reinforces these codes that are being put into place for English society at an ever-changing era in English culture. So it's only fitting that we actually go to, well, we're not going to the source. I did not read the full Book of the Courtier, but we have looked at scholarly work that analyzes.
Dug a little deeper onto what is the Book of the Courtier.
Exactly. Yeah. And through this, we'll be able to really dig into what was going on in the court in Messina.
Yes. And also what was going on in English society, specifically the upper classes that Shakespeare was exposed to through his work when they were performing at court. And, you know, we've also talked about how Shakespeare comments on court behaviors and satirizes what's going on at court. There's this dialogue between the theater and sort of like the government, the
courtly government.
The courtly government, Parliament too, but like the courtly government, the celebrity of the early modern era.
Exactly. And so for this episode, we're going to zoom out and take a look at the Book of the Courtier for English society, and then we're going to zoom in and we're going to see the Book of the Courtier in Messina in Much Ado. And Elise, you are going to set the stage for the Book of the Courtier.
Yes. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of very high-level Book of the Courtier information, as well as some very high-level Much Ado About Nothing and the Courtier information. And then, like you said, we're going to dig into some specific examples about the Book of the Courtier, and then get even more specific in how it appears in Much Ado About Nothing. So, as we've briefly mentioned, the Book of the Courtier is written by Baldassare Castiglione, and there's like 4 books to it. It is a lengthy treatise on what makes an ideal courtier, or as happens in the 3rd book, the ideal court lady, who therefore is worthy to advise the prince or princess or political leader of their nation. And it is published in 1528, and it becomes as you said, very popular in the sort of emerging genre of courtesy books or books of manners and how to behave, especially in the royal court. And it is inspired by Castiglione's time in the Spanish court during his time as ambassador of the Holy See. And he sets the book in his years as a courtier in the Duchy of Urbino. And it is kind of coming out as the high Renaissance in Italy is starting to wane, and these small courts are starting to fade due to the Italian wars. It was widely read by Shakespeare's contemporaries in Italian, English, or Latin. As you mentioned, the printing press is going so fast and so rapid. Things are being printed so rapidly. And while we do not know for sure that Shakespeare had a copy of this book, it is incredibly popular. And we definitely know that figures such as Francis Bacon, King James I, Ben Jonson, John Marston, Thomas Nash, and other figures that Shakespeare that we definitely know interacted with or were very influential in London of Shakespeare's time, they owned or read the Courtier. And it is so popular that, in fact, William Ireland, if you remember the forger from our episode on Anne Hathaway, who forged a bunch of Shakespeare ephemera, forged Shakespeare's name into a 1603 edition of the Book of the Courtier. So, yes. So it was incredibly popular. For Elizabethans seeking self-improvement, scholar Daniel Javitch notes that, quote, Castiglione's perfect courtier had become an important and appealing model of civilized conduct, unquote. And Walter Raleigh also notes that for writers in particular, the Courtier, quote, proved an excellent book to steal from, unquote. So Shakespeare references Castiglione in Love's Labour's Lost, Measure for Measure, Hamlet, and Othello. And then it was, according to my reading, which is Philip D. Collington's Stuffed with All Honorable Virtues, Much Ado About Nothing, and the Book of the Courtier, first suggested in 1901 by Mary August Scott that, quote, Shakespeare modeled the merry war of wits between Benedick and Beatrice on the verbal sparring between Castiglione's Gaspare Pallavicino and Emilia Piglia, unquote. Collington argues that Shakespeare does more than simply, quote, borrow character types, rework stock situations, or rehash humanist cliches about rhetoric and the arts, unquote, from the Courtier. Collington goes on to say that, for example, while Benedick and Beatrice directly parallel the main characters of the Courtier, there's a lot more intertextual play and parallels than just copy-paste, copy-paste. Let's put a new name and a new hat on and write new words for Castiglione's characters.
And that's really interesting because I believe in our Stuff to Chew On episode, we talked about many of the sources that we looked at when we're looking at where did Shakespeare get his inspiration? I think we might have mentioned Castiglione in the Book of the Courtier, but I don't remember us mentioning that couple specifically. It was like, oh, Benedick and Beatrice are an invention of Shakespeare's. But it seems like there's something that's more rooted in a pre-existing
and
text.
the argument here that Collington makes is that it's not a direct source. It's not something that we can say, this is Petrarch and Pyramus and Thisbe, or this is Petrarch and Romeo and Juliet and Pyramus and Thisbe. Like, it's not that direct. It's just kind of like sort of permeates it.
Gotcha.
And it's more of in dialogue with the courtier. So there are parallels. So I'll go through some of them. The play and the courtesy book compare courtship to military exercises. And among other parallels, there's this character of Balthazar in Much Ado who might be an homage to Baldassare Castiglione. Baldassare is Italian for Balthazar. And unlike other Balthazars in Shakespeare, such as the merchant in Comedy of Errors, the footman in Romeo and Juliet, and the letter carrier in Merchant of Venice, Much Ado's Balthazar, quote, participates in several popular courtier-like pastimes, dancing, debating, uttering social adages, composing witticisms, and playing music, unquote. And Collington wonders, quote, is it really a coincidence that Balthazar, or Baldassare Castiglione, discusses with Don Pedro, the play's courtly prince, the signal importance of perfection, unquote. Additionally, Benedick, and I'll go into this more later, but Benedick eventually represents Castiglione's ideal courtier.
That's so interesting because Balthazar is kind of a strange character when you think about like, what is his purpose? He sings songs and but if he's like a potential insert for Castiglione.
Collington's just like, is that what's happening here?
Yeah, and of course it's not like she's wondering, but it's a very interesting thought to go down.
Furthermore, comparing the courtier to Much Ado can add some clarity to some of the more confusing passages of Much Ado. For example, I think we even wondered this in either our summary or Stuff to Chew On. At the end of the play, Leonato and his brother Antonio have a really long discussion about Leonato's grief over Hero's death, even though as characters, both of them should know that Hero is alive and not guilty of the slander because they were all there. And this section involves Leonato chastising Antonio for trying to comfort him with proverbs as consolatory advice. And this is very thematically linked to the courtier, which declared that, quote, human interactions are too complex, provisional, and dissimulative for simple precepts to apply, unquote. And provides a contrast to the contemporary English practice. It's what was happening in Shakespeare's time, where people would, quote, mine scholarly texts for proverbs, behavioral maxims, and other forms of preceptual medicine, unquote. So Shakespeare, in Much Ado About Nothing, seems to be reaffirming the broader meaning of the text of the courtier while satirizing those Englishmen who are using it as a sort of like recipe book, instruction manual, IKEA buildings instructions to become the perfect courtier. And the book also provides a blueprint for the game of wit that Benedick and Beatrice engage in their lines, I pray thee now, tell me, for which of my bad parts didst thou first fall in love with me? For all of them together, which maintain so politic a state of evil that they will not admit any good part to intermingle with them. But for which of my good parts did you first suffer love for me? Suffer love, a good epithet. I do suffer love indeed, for I acknowledge thee against my will. The version of this game of wit in the courtier, quote, acknowledges the inevitability of personal imperfection and the importance of limiting vices to those which would inflict minimal harm on the beloved. This spirit of compromise enables participants to aspire to a literary, courtly ideal, but reconcile themselves in the real world to personal failings and social exigencies, such as the necessity of getting along with an imperfect spouse, unquote. And through the course of the play, we see Benedick become an ideal courtier and Beatrice who reconcile themselves to the fact that they are fallible, they are imperfect, and so is their beloved. And the vices that they have are minimal in the spectrum of vices. There are things that are bigger deals than others. And that is, again, Shakespeare kind of reinforcing what Shakespeare is saying, might be saying is the thesis of the courtier, which is the grace that the ideal courtier is supposed to have is not a laundry list of things they're able to do and behaviors that they have, but is instead the ability to be comfortable with imperfection. And I know that you have more specifically, since we're dealing with a comedy, what the Book of the Courtier says about comedy and humor. So let's dive into that a little bit, and then we'll come back to where we can see that in Much Ado About Nothing.
All right, that sounds great. So the part of the Courtier that I specifically looked at is book 2. And my source for today's episode is a chapter from Indira Ghosh, their book, Shakespeare and Laughter, A Cultural History. And the chapter I looked at is called Courtliness and Laughter. And so book 2 discusses prescriptions that govern the proper art of jesting.
Mm-hmm.
So as all of these elements of being a member of the court are being codified, there is a correct and a less correct way to jest. So what do you think the key is to the proper art of jesting? It is an early modern standard that we have talked about throughout the course of our work, especially in Romeo and Juliet and Much Ado.
It shouldn't be about someone. It shouldn't harm someone else. It shouldn't be at someone else's expense.
Not quite.
Okay.
When we've talked about a lot of things that come with codes.
Oh,
yes.
Moderation.
Exactly. Moderation. You have got it. That is the key. That is the key to the proper art of jesting. And there are more specifics along the way. So yes, moderation is the art, governs the proper art of jesting. And derision should be constrained by rules, according to the Book of the Courtier. So jeering at some poor unfortunate soul or jokes about the vicious are frowned upon, as are those that will call into question the reputation of a lady.
Ooh.
Yeah. We'll get there when we circle back around to Much Ado. Yeah. Blasphemous jests and indecency should be avoided, particularly in the presence of ladies. And the courtiers warn each other to take care neither to offend the powerful nor to mock the weak. Both discretion and compassion are held up as ideals which shape the conduct of the exemplary courtier. So those are the guidelines, how to jest. And it's important to talk about this because we see a lot of jesting going on in Much Ado and then also throughout many other plays in Shakespeare's canon. And Castiglione's call for equality of jesting is one that doesn't humiliate rivals, but rather displays wit in a duel or repartee and wordplay. It's all about recreational laughter for the courtier, and the art of correct jesting is an essential skill to acquire in a courtly society. I do want to note that there is a standard for courtly jesting, one as a courtier should not descend to the low level of a professional jester or a buffoon. So there is a rank there as you are, as we're exploring these characters who are jesting, it has to be at a certain courtly level.
Yes.
And Castiglione also introduces this notion of sprezzatura. It's a studied negligence. Did you read about that?
Yeah, it's I refer to it as the grace, the ease. Mm-hmm. You're just kind of nonchalantly this way.
Yes, you are making sure that all art, whatever is done or said, appears without effort, almost as if one doesn't even think about it.
You shouldn't be trying too hard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, if people can see the work that's been put into your wit and your jest, then you're doing it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And this concept was influential in molding the ideal of the English gentleman that came later. So right now, I'm talking about the Italian courtier, and of course it was translated into English, but right here, this is the courtier. And Castiglione takes the ideals of concealing art from both Cicero's treatise on duties, on obligations, as well as Ovid's The Art of Love. And Castiglione was not the only author who was writing about conduct. He was not the only one writing conduct books. Another one that was popular during Shakespeare's era was Erasmus's On Good Manners for Boys, and it was published in 1526 and translated in 1530, so around the same time that the Book of the Courtier was both published as well as translated into English. And Erasmus's treatise drew on the medieval concept of courtesy and the classical ideal of urbanity, so a refinement of manner, but with the humanist twist, which was very Renaissance. And it also emphasized the link between the personal and the public, which was starting to become really important in Renaissance as well as early modern society. So during this time period, there was this new role of the aristocrat who served the nation state. And as public society was changing, birth was no longer a sufficient criterion for membership as an elite. There were qualifications that you had to have through your demeanor. And Erasmus addressed his remarks on manners to children in general, not just the well-born. So anyone could have virtue and manners. And as far as laughter was concerned, this is what Erasmus said about laughter. Quote, To laugh at every word or deed is the sign of a fool. To laugh at none, the sign of a blockhead. It is quite wrong to laugh at improper words or actions. Loud laughter and the immoderate mirth that shakes the whole body and is for that reason called discord by the Greeks are unbecoming to any age, but much more so to youth. The neighing sound that some people make when they laugh is also unseemly, and the person who opens his mouth wide and erictus, with wrinkled cheeks and exposed teeth, is also impolite. The face should express mirth in such a way that it neither distorts the appearance of the mouth nor evinces a dissolute mind. If something so funny should occur that it produces uncontrolled laughter of this sort, the face should be covered with a napkin or with the hand. Unquote. Yeah. So there's a right way and a wrong way to laugh.
Yes. It just made me think of Midsummer Night's Dream, where there's that scene where Bottom makes some sort of noise and Titania's like, tie up my love's tongue, bring him silently. And a lot of productions I've seen will make him like, because he's a donkey at that point, he'll like, hee-haw.
Yeah, he'll neigh.
He'll like neigh laugh. And so that popped into my head as you're talking about like this level of laughter that's unbecoming.
Yeah, the neighing sound that some people make. Yeah.
Right.
So it also makes you go like, did Shakespeare read this and decide to, we'll never know, but.
Yeah. I mean, we've also talked about like things that are just so permeate a culture that you don't need to read the book to know that like it says something like this or that like this is considered uncouth because it just is so in the culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also interesting that like a space that is encouraging laughter like the theater has to address the expectations of like proper laughter and like I wonder, and this is for a later research, later thinking, but like the plays that were written for like the public playhouses versus for the court and what those jokes are like and
yes
how the
get
audience...
out of my brain
and how the audience was supposed to laugh.
Were these expectations put on the groundlings or are some of the things that we understand about the groundlings, are they not held to this standard at all? Because we know that it was more raucous than the court. How did this apply? How do the jokes of the plays that were played in the Globe differ from the plays that were played at like the inns of the court?
Yeah. And that is a total theater maker thing that still happens today where people are like, oh, we're going to be in this space, so we're going to make sure our jokes are maybe more like PG or G for this audience, but then we can have a couple more like,
we'll
PG-13.
do a midnight show.
Exactly. We'll do a midnight show.
Right.
And I wonder if these conduct books, these conduct manuals inform Shakespeare and like how he approached joke writing in his plays.
Right.
And as far as like the courtesy of jokes and laughter, there was a shift from like the medieval courtesy to this new Italian-inspired courtesy from like the Book of the Courtier. So medieval culture had attached an immense importance to courtesy. And we see that because there were manuals from the medieval time period. But manners had a new urgency in early modern Europe because of the development of the aristocracy. Earlier codifications had been addressed to young pages within noble households. And so the manuals stressed the household rituals of service. But in early modern conduct literature, the focus on the meal and the household disappears and it shifts to like proper conduct in society at large. So urbanity and social relations is a very central concept in the art of jesting. According to Anne Bryson, there are two main impulses in the codification of manners. One of them is self-preservation and the other is accommodation. And this goes into something that you said, Elise. I'll first talk about self-preservation and then accommodation. But because elites were centered on the city and the court, manners became a technique for self-display. And this identity could be molded by behaviors instilled within education. And one factor in that is how one laughed and what one laughed about were now indicators of taste and style. So there is a difference between laughing and making jokes that are from a polished wit versus horseplay and vulgar humor. So that's the first thing is self-presentation, how you present yourself. The second is accommodation. And at court, it was imperative not to cause offense. And that became a really big preoccupation for courtiers and members of the court. And this world, this early modern world was becoming more fluid in terms of social statuses. There was a lot of fluidity between peers versus the medieval household inferiors. And so it was really crucial to show a modicum of respect to all members of society. And one aspect of that was laughter. So laughter in the courts took on a function of diffusing tension and smoothing over belligerent situations. So what you were saying about like having grace, you need to have grace within these battles of wits. Part of that is an accommodation. And so like that became a very central part of joking, jesting within those early modern courts. Castiglione's ideal courtier was one who was a work of art, whose prime function was to delight. And this is a philosophy that was accepted by early modern courtier and poet George Puttenham, who I think we've talked about before, but also Sir John Harrington.
Oh, who we've definitely
talked about. He also
our fave.
Like, yes, we love him. And so like to these English courtiers, the ideal courtier was this work of art. And Castiglione's ideal courtier's laughter was a resource for like the maintenance of having pleasurable social interactions within a new blossoming courtier society. And you mentioned ladies of the court. I do also want to bring up ladies of the court and how the Book of Courtier, as well as English society, viewed codifying laughter for women as well. So conduct literature in the Renaissance was not specifically directed at women. We've talked about this before. Like there were books and conduct books that like were based in Puritan morals as well as household management, but that was directed more at the male householder, the male husband. And it wasn't until Richard Braithwaite's The English Gentleman in 1631 when the first manual of manners was aimed at a female audience. And this is interesting because we know that women were less literate than men in this era, but girls and women were still reading. So even though girls did not attend grammar school, families of the middling sort sent both boys and girls to elementary petty schools to learn how to read. The nobility had tutors to educate daughters. And in 1533, Thomas More estimated that at least half of all adults could read. And so it's interesting that like this type of literature was not aimed at women until 1631. After 1570, there was a market of literature that was specifically directed at women. So there was literature for court ladies, household manuals, and practical guides on medicine for citizens' wives, and devotional books and almanacs for chambermaids. So women could read.
Yeah, and like the herbals and like we've talked about like all this material that's being produced for women is just maybe not like quote unquote literary to the literary minds of Shakespeare's time.
Exactly. But either way, there was this like women audience who during Shakespeare's time like was not technically the recipient of conduct manuals, like, you know, Elle magazine or whatever.
The Ladies' Guide, the Ladies' Home Journal, like that they like become very popular with even like today, right? Like you mentioned Elle magazine. These are essentially the descendants of these manuals. And I think it's very interesting to point out that it's specifically like these types of etiquette books that we're talking about. Because we've talked about there's plenty of like pamphlets being written during this time about how ladies should behave, how women should behave. And like, we know therefore that like women were doing the things that those pamphlets are being like, they shouldn't be doing this because they were doing it.
Because they were doing it.
That Puritan book seems to come out just at like the right time for that political religious movement to be pushing forward some ideas about how women should behave in England.
Yes. But even though male courtiers were taught there was like a proper way to laugh, women's laughter was actually deplored. Ovid, this would be, I believe, The Art of Love. Ovid said, quote, "Let the mouth be but moderately opened. Let the dimples on either side be small, and let the bottom of the lip cover the top of the teeth," unquote. So it's like, don't laugh, don't smile. And one reason for this attitude towards women smiling and laughing, or I guess mostly laughing, is because mouths were a symbol of sexual availability for women of that time. I believe you talked about like makeup and like blushing and how that whole area was signaling sexual availability. Yeah. So,
and we've also talked about how makeup at the time and like the amount of time women are spending on their appearance is like a sexual signal to men during this time. In my reading, there was also briefly a mention that like in the sprezzatura, the grace of the lady courtier, there is also this like, she doesn't try too hard at how she like dresses and makes herself up. She doesn't wear too much makeup, you know. We've talked about that sort of thing. Like and how, like, you know, it doesn't necessarily reflect what was actually happening in the court.
Yeah. Well, we know this because we know about Elizabeth's outfits and we know about Queen Anne being very fashionable. So,
yeah.
But like laughter and like, I guess what a woman did with her mouth was considered controversial, and like there were expectations. There was codification of that. So in Stephen Guazzo's The Civil Conversation, published in 1574 and translated into English between 1581 to 86, that book exhorts, quote, "Silence in a woman is greatly commended, for it seateth her forth much, and maketh her thought to be very wise. Yea, she must not only have regard to keep her tongue, but besides to accompany her words, her laughter, her looks and behavior, with such a grave and stately majesty as beseemeth a matron," unquote. And this just flashes Hero to me. Like, this is the proper way a woman of the court should be behaving. However, Castiglione actually endorses the witty conversation of the lady courtier. Maybe not like a guffaw, but, you know, according to Giuliano, who's a character in the Book of Jesting, a woman must be agreeable, witty, and discreet. And I'm thinking like, that reminds me of Beatrice, even though she doesn't necessarily hit those ideal like lady of the court attributes perfectly.
Yes.
Those are the three things that she is kind of going for, like, or the things that are expected of her. She's agreeable and witty and discreet. And I think that for the majority of the play, she's mostly just witty.
Yes.
1 out of 3 out of the 3.
Yeah. Yeah. And she becomes, you know, she like grows into these other things, especially once she like has heard her detractions said aloud, when she's heard Hero. It's actually funny that you said Hero sounds ideal, because my reading also pointed out that Hero, while Hero is like presented as the ideal, she's doing a lot of behaviors that are like not ideal. There's an entire scene where Margaret and Ursula are helping her prepare for the wedding, and they're talking about like what she's wearing, and there's a lot of like work and thought being put into like how she presents herself for the wedding. And my reading noted that this could be included to show that Hero is not this ideal that Claudio says she is upon like first seeing her.
Yeah.
Right. That she's also got these things that would be considered flaws to the ideal courtier.
Yeah.
And that she wears makeup. She does her hair. She puts a lot of effort into what she's wearing. Yeah.
And whether they are overtly or subtly concerned with the Book of the Courtier and their self-presentation as either a courtier or a lady of the court, this also could be like pulling back the curtain and making a comment on the fact that the work of art, this effortlessness that the ideal courtier or lady of the court presents to the public it's like there is work that goes into a work of art. And so it's impossible to think that something is effortless like that.
Yeah.
But anyways, that is my reading on Book 2, The Art of Jesting. I think that as we continue talking about the Book of the Courtier today, we can like circle around and look at where jesting, wit, laughter all comes into this. But this is laying the foundation for the fact that like laughter, wit, all of that were grounded in like there was a time and a place and a way in which you could engage in this kind of comedy in order to be like ideal.
Yeah. And I'm going to pick up right where you left off. You mentioned the play might be saying like the people who appear like ideal courtiers, these works of art, and like strive for that, like striving for that is actually putting in effort and not becoming the ideal. And the ideal is actually accepting this other thing. And we're going to look at Benedick's character development in contrast to other characters and over the course of the play. And I'll talk about some jesting in just a moment. He starts sort of at this like opposite of the courtier ideal. He does not have a lot of grace at the beginning of the play, and then he becomes closer to the courtier ideal after he converts to love and has his own imperfections exposed to him, much like Beatrice. At the beginning of the play, he is exhibiting behaviors such as his cuckold joke at the expense of Leonato that are, as you mentioned, not graceful, according to the courtier, and are actually discouraged by many different speakers in the book. One character of Castiglione's, Federico Fregoso, states that a courtier should, quote, refrain from praising himself out of purpose, from using a noisome sauciness, from casting out other while a word thinking to make men laugh, which for that it is spoken out of time will appear cold and without any grace, unquote. So like you were saying, there's a time and a place for jesting.
Mm-hmm.
Should refrain from just making a joke to get the attention on you. As Beatrice will say, she says to Benedick, like, are you still speaking? Nobody marks you.
Yeah.
No one's listening.
No one's listening, so stop.
Right. So he's like being very anti-courtier. That same character of Castiglione's that I mentioned also, quote, adds that men who utter filthy words in the presence of honorable women in order to impress their male friends should be shunned from polite company, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, ultimately, like, this band of brothers who show up at Leonato's are, we will find out, all not well-behaving gentlemen.
Mm-mm.
Another character of Castiglione states that there is nothing so unbecoming for a courtier as, you mentioned this earlier, here's the full quote, quote, common jesters and parasites, and such as with fond matters to move men to laugh, unquote. Consider this alongside Beatrice's description of Benedick in 1:1, that, quote, he hath every month a new sworn brother, unquote, and will hang upon Claudio like a disease. She also straight up calls him the prince's jester in 2:1. So
that is true.
He is being a parasite. He is grabbing onto whichever new friend, whoever's going to like laugh at his jokes, he's going to be best friends with, and he's behaving like a common jester. The book that you talked about, The Art of Jesting, my reading notes that much of that book is devoted to kind of satirizing the members of the court who would sort of view, quote, telling jokes and winning these drawing room amusements as the essence of courtly service, unquote. So like telling jokes to make jokes, being the star of the show, being a jester is not the thing to do as a courtier. It is to be, as you were saying, witty with grace and to tell jokes at the right time in the right company.
It kind of reminds me of like a modern equivalency that I'm thinking of is like the improv friend who's just making jokes to make jokes and like get people to stare and like laugh at them versus the kid in the back of the class who makes that excellent zinger that like hardly anyone hears, and it's so graceful and it's got such tact. It's not to seek attention.
Right. That's a lot of what this is. It's about the grace sort of thing. Is like you just are you and you're not trying to seek attention, especially from like the prince or the noble, right?
Yeah.
So back to Benedick real quick, because I think that's such a good example, Courtney. But after Benedick's conversion to love and moderation, we see Don Pedro and Claudio in a new light. They appear boorish and ungentlemanly, especially during and after Hero's slander and fake death. In contrast, my reading Collington notes that, quote, Benedick's willingness to defend a wronged lady's honor even to the point of defying his prince distinguishes him as having achieved the highest level of service outlined in the courtier, unquote. So Benedick, we see him fail at the superficial courtly behaviors such as poetry, appropriately timed jokes, and enjoying music. He's not great at dancing. He's not a great masker, and he tends to be really outlandish in his fashion and grooming. However, he, quote, displays unparalleled loyalty in love, chivalry in defending Hero's honor, and determination in correcting his prince's errors, unquote. Claudio, on the other hand, succeeds at all of these superficially refined qualities that make him appear like the ideal courtier or that piece of art. Claudio, quote, cuts an attractive figure and knows all the latest fencing techniques, but he lacks the essential qualities of an honorable soldier. By making Benedick consistently fail to achieve minor ideals found in the courtier, Shakespeare exposes the dangers inherent in attaching disproportionately high values to superficial details, which eclipse the book's major criteria for courtly perfection, unquote, which I'll go into in a bit.
Okay.
Speaking of Claudio, the Claudio Hero subplot can be read as an illustration of what happens due to sexual slander and poor leadership, which are major themes in the third and fourth books of the courtier. While, quote, honor is an absolute, it either exists entirely or it vanishes into the air. Because of its essential fragility, the courtier recommends against the application of inflexible criteria to the evolving complexities of human affairs. In particular, a woman's chastity should remain off limits when recounting merry jests, and impugning a woman's honor in earnest is an even more grave offense, unquote, as you were saying about jests.
Yeah.
Castiglione's book builds progressively in its exploration of this courtier ideal to, quote, two climactic discussions in Book 4, one concerning the courtier's primary function as effective advisor to his prince, and the second exploring the operations of Neoplatonic love, unquote. So let's talk a little bit about the effective advisor to the prince and this like Neoplatonic love for your commander or your prince. So in Much Ado, Don Pedro is shown to be an ineffective leader. He doesn't question his half-brother's assertions about Hero, even though he's just recently forgiven and pardoned his half-brother for events that happened prior to the action of the play. Nor is there really any mention by Don Pedro or Claudio of confronting or interrogating Don John, or like even wanting to, when they find out that Hero didn't actually die and that she is not guilty of what she was accused of. Don Pedro is shown to believe unreliable third parties and hearsay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then like what's the point of having a counsel or a right-hand man to advise you if you don't ask for counsel?
Right. Or, you just surround yourself with yes men, because Claudio's best defense for what he does during the course of this play is that he just is following Don Pedro and doesn't question Don Pedro.
That's true. And then Benedick could have given him another way to look at it, because during the accusation, he was like listening to Beatrice.
Yeah, he goes the other direction. He listens to the person who's like, I've been her bedfellow for like years, and like, no, this is literally the first night we've been apart because I have a cold. This isn't her. But Claudio just follows Don Pedro. According to Collington, quote, by making Don Pedro vouch for the veracity of such obvious fabrications with such disastrous results, Shakespeare illustrates warnings about princely authority set forth in the Courtier, unquote. According to the Courtier, it is Don Pedro's duty to have good judgment about those in his immediate circle and to know their traits and qualities. So, sure, while he doesn't know that his half-brother is actively plotting against Claudio, he should know Don John well enough to know that he would do something like that, and he should be a better judge of who to trust and who to not trust in his immediate circle. Additionally, according to the Courtier, this princely mistake of trusting the wrong people is a very serious failure of a prince, and therefore Don Pedro is a very serious failure of a leader. And as you said, in that moment where Don Pedro and Claudio accuse Hero based on, a very flimsy piece of evidence that they saw somebody who was wearing her clothes talk at a window, and that they've been told hearsay, and they refuse to listen to anybody of her household who knows her better. It's Benedick who stays with the party of the women and listens to their evidence. And it's like this moment that's kind of crucial in him becoming the ideal of the courtier. And my reading also noted that like Don Pedro is also their military leader, right? So if you stage this scene where they're all in their dress military uniforms because it's a wedding, and basically you see Benedick just not go with the rest of his battalion and his general, it's a pretty impactful visual. And Benedick later goes, I'm not going to follow you anymore. I'm retiring from your service because you're being so dishonorable that I can't follow you.
Yeah, and this is also set up really well in the beginning of the play because like warfare and courtship are linked with wordplay, and so it's setting the scene for like this abandonment.
Yes. It's not just like I'm not going to hang out with you as a friend anymore. It's like I quit my job because you are being dishonorable as somebody that I'm not supposed to quit. Like,
yeah, so it becomes insubordination.
Yeah. But it feels risky, like you are risking falling out of the prince's favor by going against what he's saying and doing and not being a yes man. But the courtier in book 4 paints this as like, this is the ideal. If you are a good advisor to your prince, you should be able to tell him when he's doing something wrong. And in the final moments of the play, quote, Benedick assumes the mantle of the courtier ideal, not because he has achieved a high degree of superficial courtly refinement, but because he chooses love over suspicion and service over slander, unquote. As we've been talking about, he chooses love and also like logic over the influence of his superior officer. And then the final actions that he takes in the play are, quote, 1, to stand by his decision to marry, 2, to forgive his friend, 3, to lead a dance, 4, to advise Don Pedro, and 5, to mete justice out to the enemy of his prince. Although there is no line in which Benedick expressly resumes his service to Don Pedro, the 5th action listed above implicitly confirms that he has rejoined the prince's retinue. In marrying and rejoining the military, and in recommending that his military commander get a wife to gain social prestige, Benedick strikes that elusive balance between social and political finesse, and in the process achieves personal happiness, political advancement, and social stability in Messina, unquote. So, in all that, he's able to achieve a sort of comic sprezzatura, that effortless grace and charm of imperfection that the courtier defines and tells you that you should be seeking.
Mm-hmm.
It's effortless. You're just being yourself, and it doesn't require a lot of effort.
Mm-hmm.
And to speak just a little bit about this Elizabethan misogyny that exists and enforces male homosocial groups of peers, and that like you're kind of forced to woo and marry ladies, and like kind of what this play says about that. My reading noted that through Benedick, who is, quote, the male who comes to align himself most strongly with the ladies, who upholds such ideals as civic order, social justice, and family honor, Benedick also, despite his anti-feminist quips and anti-matrimonial barbs, upholds the sanctity of marriage, concluding that no staff, the symbol of authority, is more reverend than one tipped with a horn, the symbol of cuckoldry. In more stark contrast, Claudio's continued allegiance to the unmarried prince Don Pedro, at the expense of his relationship with Hero, is presented as retrograde and unwise. In Claudio's uncourtly worldview, slander can kill, but in Benedick's more refined understanding of the inevitability of imperfections appearing in the beloved, slander merely injures, and it is the perpetrators, not the victims, who should receive correction. Unquote. So Shakespeare is kind of saying, the thing that English society is doing right now of taking this book, The Courtier, and kind of taking quotes out of context and making a list of behaviors that a courtier looks like. That's not what the book said. It's like he's being a big nerd. And he's like, that's not what the book says. And he's also saying that like the misogyny of this world is also uncouth. It is okay for women to not be perfect. And that's a part of being a good courtier, is to be okay with that and to not have such a stick up your butt about other people's behavior.
One that's tipped with the horn.
Yeah. Well, you want it is better to have a staff tipped with a horn than have it up your butt. I think is maybe what Shakespeare's saying here. Again, The Courtier is not just a source for Much Ado, and Shakespeare didn't simply copy or imitate it in writing Much Ado. There's a greater textual interplay between these two texts. And according to Collington, quote, rather, Much Ado represents a profound thematic and philosophical engagement with Castiglione's text, in which Shakespeare exposes as false the distinction between the self-fashioning of the aspiring courtier in the private realm and the selfless devotion of the advisor who serves his prince in the political realm, unquote. Shakespeare dramatizes the thesis of Castiglione, that gentlemanly refinement serves both the political and romantic spheres, and shows that furthermore, these spheres do not need to be mutually exclusive. You can be a gentleman in wooing and in the political sphere, and you should do it to serve your prince, not to better yourself.
And that's a pretty damning message to put into the play, considering there was also, in addition to the Book of the Courtier, there were pamphlets and satires about specifically Elizabeth's courtiers who were behaving
self-serving,
who were self-serving, trying to move up the ranks with Elizabeth. So it sounds as though this dramatization of the thesis was also permeating in early modern England as well. Maybe not specifically about the Book of the Courtier, but this idea of like self-serving versus serving the sovereign.
Yeah, versus that true nobility is not the outward shows of nobility, but we've talked about before, like it's about doing your duty, even when your duty is at risk to your own personal advancement. I think that's a really interesting note. I also think that like as theater makers, I can't wait to revisit this one, because I want to think about Don Pedro and Claudio and the Much Ado boys as they are often presented, because I think we often get, well, Don John is a plain dealing villain, and like we know that from the get-go, and we know that Borachio is a lower class individual who will go along and spread slander about a woman, and I think we often get like they are bad. Claudio and Don Pedro and Benedick, they are good. And what this kind of opened my eyes to is like, what if at the beginning they're all kind of same? They're not so different. So it's not such a surprise that Claudio's such a jerk to Hero, because I often see and hear just like how the Claudio and Hero subplot is difficult for modern readers and audiences to accept that like that ends up okay.
Yeah.
What this made me think about is like, is that because, we often present Claudio as just this sweet younger guy who's kind of just going along, and like, what if he's not great from the beginning. And so it's not such a like weird switch for Claudio to like believe that this is possible for Hero.
Yeah, and on top of that, all members of the courts, both the men and the women, would have been educated in the values of the Book of the Courtier, or at least, even if it's not reading that book, the values that were placed on being a upstanding courtier and an upstanding lady of the court. So Hero, who is silent, is also jesting. And Beatrice, who is witty, also knows what her place in the court should be in terms of her behavior. And both Hero and Beatrice are going against their expectations, whether it's like overtly or subtly, or pushing back against it and then moving towards it.
Yeah, and that it's not what I also found really interesting is that the thesis that the play and the courtier land with is it's not about being perfect or appearing perfect. It's about accepting imperfections and correcting the like vices that are actually harmful, like speaking ill of somebody, slandering people,
making inappropriate jokes that are at someone's expense.
Yeah, but even in there, like there's a hierarchy of things that are bad. Like Benedick may tell some jokes at people's expense, but is that as bad as impugning an innocent woman's virtue? And like, no, like on the spectrum of bad, like get rid of the things that are worse, like triage the things that are worse, and then like you can work on the other things later. But like no one's gonna be perfect, and some people are gonna tell a joke at the wrong time, or they're not gonna be good at dancing, and that doesn't make them not a good courtier if they can do the big things well.
That makes sense.
Sorry.
No, I mean the Book of the Courtier is also a text that is a challenge.
It's a dialogue, and like yeah.
I'm excited to read the play again to like sift through what is Shakespeare nodding to, like what the courtiers were pulling and like out of context using, but then also where are those moments where characters actually engage in the true thesis. And that's something that as a person reflecting, it's like, oh, I need to go back and look at the text and notice those things, because I think that Much Ado has this performance baggage. And stepping back from the performance baggage and looking at it through this lens of the Book of the Courtier is going to like root out some things that I think provide great meaning to performances moving forward. So I'm really excited for us to revisit this and look at it through this lens, because I think it'll help to make some things less problematic, or make things more interesting, or make characters villains who we once saw as bros. So this has been a very fascinating turn of our season, because I was not expecting to be studying the Book of the Courtier.
No. I found some articles while researching something else, and it was like, is this a thing worth researching? And yeah, I also didn't expect this to like be like, oh, is there a different way to look at the Claudio Hero subplot maybe through this?
Yeah. And I'm also excited to look at like the role of laughter and jesting, because part of the push for Benedick and Beatrice is like jesting of sort. You know, there's jesting and there's wits, and there's a prank.
Yeah. They're a match. They both have this wit thing going on. Yeah, this illuminated a lot more than I expected it to. I think either of us expected it to.
Yeah.
Let us know if this has also made your brain think about this play in a new light. And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare, Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare, Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, ShakespeareAnyone.com, follow us on Instagram at ShakespeareAnyonePod, or Twitter at ShakespeareAnyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any, and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Love's Labour's Lost, Act 5, Scene 1, said by Costard. I marvel thy master hath not eaten thee for a word, for thou art not so long by the head as honorifica billeta dinatibus.